Right now, without you asking it to, something inside your eye is working. Not the part that sees, not the part that moves the eye left or right. Something smaller, something tucked so far inside the ordinary business of vision that most people will go their entire lives without once thinking about it. And yet it's been going since before you had a face worth mentioning, since the weeks when your body was still deciding what shape to take. Welcome to the Sleepy Biologist. Wherever you're lying down tonight, whatever the room sounds like around you, I'm glad you're here. There's a muscle inside your eye called the ciliary muscle. It lives in a ring just behind the coloured part of the eye you can see in a mirror, and its whole job, is to change the shape of your lens. When something is close, the muscle contracts, the lens thickens. When you look far away, the muscle releases, the lens flattens back out. Thousands of times a day this happens. You don't feel it. You don't feel most of what your body does, actually. The body has a particular talent for keeping its own work quiet. But here is the thing about muscles that work constantly, that contract and release and contract again for hours without rest. They don't always let go completely. You've probably felt this in your shoulders, in your jaw, that low, dull grip that stays even after the reason for it is gone, after the stressful call ends, after the deadline passes, after the day is technically over. The muscle was asked to hold, and it held, and then it just kept a little of that. Not all of it. Just a fraction. Enough that rest isn't quite rest, even when it looks like it from the outside. The ciliary muscle does this too. After a long stretch of near work, reading, a screen, anything that required your eye to focus at a fixed and close distance, the muscle stays slightly contracted, not dramatically. You won't feel it as pain usually, the eye doesn't announce it. What you might notice if you pay attention in the early evening when you finally look up and across the room is that far things take a moment to settle. A word on a sign, a face across the space, they blur very briefly before the eye adjusts. That lag, that small sluggish moment, is the ciliary muscle coming down from something it wasn't sure was finished. The room you're in right now probably has some low sound underneath everything. A fan somewhere, or the specific quiet that houses make when the people inside them stop moving. There's something steadying about that sound, the kind that doesn't ask for attention. The ciliary muscle is smooth muscle, which means it isn't under your voluntary control the way the muscles in your hand are. You cannot decide to relax it. You cannot command it the way you can unclench a fist. It answers to the autonomic nervous system, the branch of your nervous system that handles the background work, the things that run whether or not you're paying attention. Digestion, heart rate, the slow dilation of your pupils in a dark room. The ciliary muscle gets its instructions from a nerve called the oculomotor nerve, and those instructions arrive through a process that doesn't involve your conscious thought at all. When your brain detects blur, when an image on the retina isn't quite sharp, a signal goes out. The ciliary muscle responds, the lens shifts, the image sharpens. None of this was your decision, and so you cannot decide to stop it either. What you can do is give the eye less reason to keep working. Distance is one of them. When you look at something far away, across a room, out a window, at nothing in particular, the ciliary muscle receives less signal to contract. It loosens by default. The lens, left without instruction to thicken, finds its thinnest natural shape. This is sometimes called the eye's resting state, though even that phrase is little generous. The eye, like a lot of the body, is always doing something. Resting is just doing something slower. But there's a state beyond the day's ordinary adjusting that's worth knowing about. After hours of near focus, some people experience what researchers describe as accommodative lag, a measurable delay in the muscle's return to baseline. The ciliary muscle holds its contracted shape a bit past when it should have let go. It's not damage. It's not even a flaw exactly. It's the kind of thing that happens to any tissue that's been asked to work steadily for a long time without a real break. Think about how long you were looking at something close today. The muscle was there for all of it. The strange and slightly uncomfortable thing about this, and maybe you've sensed it without having a name for it, is that the eye doesn't tell you when it is tired the way a leg tells you. There's no particular ache that maps clearly to the ciliary muscle. What you get instead is vagueness, a softness around the edges of things, a mild reluctance to focus, as though the eye is technically doing its job but with less precision than it started with. By late afternoon, some people describe this as the world looking slightly flatter, slightly less crisp, even in good light. That's the muscle not fully letting go, and tonight as you lie here, it is probably, slowly, without drama, beginning to do just that. The extraocular muscles that hold the eye in its socket will soften their grip a little. The ciliary muscle will receive fewer and fewer signals asking it to contract, because there is no near target to focus on, because the lights are low or off, because the eye is doing that specific thing it does in the last minutes before sleep, where it stops tracking deliberately and starts to drift. The lens, without instruction, will flatten out by small degrees. Not all the way, not immediately. These things take the time they take, but the direction is downward, towards something that isn't quite rest, but is as close as this particular muscle ever gets. There was a point, a specific actual point in time, when you didn't have an iris. Not you in any meaningful sense. Just a cluster of cells doing what cells do, which is mostly divide and signal and divide again, without anything resembling intention. But still, there was a before, and then, weeks later, there wasn't. It's strange to think about if you let yourself actually think about it. The eye starts forming around the 3rd week after fertilization. Not from the surface of the face, which is what you might expect. It doesn't grow inward. It comes from the brain. A small outpouching of neural tissue pushes outward from what will eventually become the forebrain, reaches toward the surface and makes contact. This is called the optic vesicle. And the moment it touches the outer layer of tissue, something called the surface ectoderm, both of them change. That kind of mutual triggering, where two things meet and both of them become something else. The iris itself comes a little later in all of this. The optic cup forms first, a 2-layered structure that will eventually become the retina, and the iris grows out from its rim forward, like something slowly pulling itself into position. The tissue that becomes the iris is a mix of origins. Some of it is neural crest cells which migrate from the back of the developing brain and travel remarkably all the way to the front of the eye. Some of it is the tissue of the optic cup itself. 2 different histories, one structure, the colour you see in a mirror, the brown or green or grey or whatever complicated shade yours happens to be. That colour is largely determined by how much melanin the stromal cells of the iris deposit, and when, and how densely. Babies are often born with eyes that look blue or grey because the melanin hasn't fully accumulated yet. The colour settles over months, sometimes over the first year or 2 of life. So the iris you have now isn't quite the one you were born with. That's the part that keeps snagging somehow, the patterns, the crypts and furrows and striations you can see in a close mirror. Those aren't painted on. They're structural. They're the surface expression of how the underlying tissue folded and compressed during development. The iris has to accommodate a pupil that changes size constantly, which means it needs to fold and unfurl. and those patterns are essentially the record of how it learned to do that. Permanent creases from a movement the body figured out before you were born. There's something almost not melancholy, that's too heavy a word, but something quietly odd about looking at those patterns and knowing they were set before you had any say in anything, before preference, before experience, before the eye had ever been asked to focus on a face or follow a moving object or stay open in bright light. The iris was already decided. The room might feel a little cooler now than when you first lay down. That particular kind of cool that settles over things when you've been still long enough. Not unpleasant, just noticeable. What's interesting, and this is the part that doesn't get mentioned much, is that the iris isn't static even after all that development settles. The sphincter and dilator muscles embedded within it are constantly making small adjustments. The iris is always in some degree of motion, always responding, always slightly different from 1 second to the next depending on light and autonomic state and a dozen other things. The pattern stays. The muscle moves within it, like a landscape that's fixed but with weather. Actually, that metaphor only goes so far. The iris isn't passive the way a landscape is. It's more that the structural pattern and the muscular activity are two different timescales happening in the same place. The pattern is developmental time. The movement is real time. Both of them are present simultaneously, layered over each other, and the eye doesn't distinguish between them. Neither do you, really, when you look at someone. The iris formation process is mostly complete by the time a baby is born, but the final colour can take months more, which means there's a window, early in life, where the eye is still becoming itself, still depositing, still settling, still deciding on the shade it'll carry for the rest of its existence. And then one day it stops, not because something finishes, just because the process slows to a rate so gradual it no longer registers as change. The cells are still doing things, still maintaining the structure, but the gross visible shift has ended. The iris you have now is probably very close to the one you'll have for the rest of your life. That's either reassuring or slightly unsettling depending on how you're feeling tonight, maybe both. The name is clinical in a way that almost feels mismatched for something so small, so quietly embedded in the daily work of seeing. Sphincter pupillae, a ring of smooth muscle fibers that sits inside the iris, circling the pupil the way a drawstring circles the opening of a bag. Except nothing about this structure is as simple or as passive as that image suggests, and the more you stay with it, the more the comparison starts to feel inadequate. Let it go then. The sphincter pupillae is roughly 1 millimeter wide, maybe a little less in some eyes. It runs in a circle, and when it contracts, which it does in response to light, in response to near focus, in response to signals arriving from the parasympathetic nervous system, the pupil gets smaller. That's the whole mechanical description. The fibers shorten, the ring tightens, the opening narrows. On paper, nothing about this is complicated, but there's a detail that doesn't usually make it into the simple explanation, and it's the one that keeps being worth returning to. The sphincter pupillae, even in genuine darkness, even when the eye has no photons to process and no near target to accommodate, does not go fully slack. It maintains what researchers describe as a resting tone, a baseline level of contraction that persists in the absence of any obvious stimulus asking for it. The pupil never opens to its true anatomical maximum unless the muscle is pharmacologically paralyzed, because under normal physiological conditions the muscle simply doesn't release all the way. There's something in that which doesn't feel fully resolved, not because the biology is unclear, but because resting tone as a phrase does a lot of quiet work. It implies rest. It implies a kind of settled baseline. But a muscle that is contracting, even gently, even at a fraction of its working capacity, is still contracting. The energy expenditure is real even if it's small. The structural consequence, a pupil that never reaches its full dilation under normal conditions, is real. Calling it rest seems like a generous reading of what's actually happening, which is that the muscle is always doing something, always holding something, even when there is no reason in the environment that would explain why. Outside, or maybe just in the wall somewhere, there is probably some low sound right now, a pipe, a distant engine, something that has been going long enough that you stopped hearing it. The kind of sound that only becomes noticeable once someone mentions that it might be there. The parasympathetic fibers that drive the sphincter pupillae travel along the oculomotor nerve, and they synapse in a small structure behind the eye called the ciliary ganglion before reaching the muscle itself, which means the signal takes a short but real journey before it arrives. There's a relay, a handoff, a moment where one neuron passes the instruction to another before the muscle finally receives it. This delay is measured in milliseconds and doesn't affect anything you'd consciously notice, but it exists, and in some technical sense, every contraction of the sphincter pupillae is the result of a chain of events rather than a single direct command. Which is true of most things the body does, but it feels more concrete somehow when the structure is this small and the pathway is this traceable. The dilator pupillae works in opposition, sympathetic innervation, fibers arranged radially rather than circularly, pulling the pupil wide when the situation calls for it. Dim light, alertness, the kind of low-level physiological arousal that the body generates in response to things it considers potentially important. The two muscles don't take turns exactly, they're active simultaneously, and the pupil's actual diameter at any given moment is the outcome of that ongoing negotiation between them. A kind of continuous tug between two systems that don't communicate directly with each other, but whose outputs are physically coupled in the same small ring of tissue. This is the part that's genuinely uncertain in interesting ways. Not uncertain because the anatomy is unknown, but uncertain in its implications. When the sympathetic system is chronically elevated, as it tends to be in people under sustained stress, the dilator gets more drive. The pupil sits wider than it would under calm conditions. The sphincter, still maintaining its resting tone, is pulling against a stronger opposing force. Whether this sustained state of low-level muscular contest has downstream effects on the tissue over long periods isn't something that's been thoroughly characterized. The muscle is smooth muscle, which has a different relationship to fatigue than skeletal muscle does. It can sustain contraction far longer without the kind of burnout that skeletal muscle experiences, but can sustain and sustains without consequence aren't quite the same thing. The honest answer is that it's not entirely clear, and there's something slightly pretending about admitting that actually, that the body can contain a process this small, this continuous, this structurally consequential, and still hold pockets of genuine uncertainty around what it costs over a lifetime to keep doing it. The sphincter pupillae in a healthy eye in a normally lit room will contract and partially relax hundreds of times between the moment you close this video and the moment you fall asleep, responding to shifts in the ambient light, to small changes in what you're attending to fluctuations in autonomic tone that have nothing to do with the eye at all. Each contraction is a real event. Each partial release is a real event. None of them reach your awareness. The eye processes them, executes them, and moves on to the next one without ever surfacing any of it into conscious experience. The muscle wants, if want is even a word that applies here, nothing more specific than to respond to what arrives. Light comes in, the pupil narrows. Light drops, the pupil widens. A near object demands focus. The sphincter assists with that too, pulling the pupil slightly smaller to increase depth of field the way stopping down a camera lens brings more of the scene into acceptable sharpness. The muscle doesn't distinguish between these reasons, it just responds to the signals it receives, in the order they arrive, with the force the signal requests. And underneath all of that, in every condition, at every hour, even now, the resting tone persists, gentle, unasked for and continuous. You've done this thousands of times, walked from somewhere bright into somewhere dim, a hallway, a bedroom, a bathroom in the middle of the night with the light off. You know the feeling, that specific, slightly unmoored second where the room isn't quite visible yet and your body is doing something about it, quiet, without being asked. That second is longer than most people realize. Full dark adaptation, the eye reaching its genuine low light sensitivity, takes somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes, depending on prior light exposure and the individual physiology of the eye. 20 to 40 minutes. The first few seconds of that process are the ones you feel as blindness or near blindness, but the adjustment is still happening, still grinding slowly forward, long after you've stopped noticing it, long after the room feels normal again. There are 2 stages, and they feel nothing like each other. The first involves the cones, the photoreceptors in the central retina responsible for colour and fine detail. They adapt quickly within the first several minutes, their photopigments regenerating after being bleached by the bright light you just left. This is the part where the room stops being a wall of darkness and starts having shapes again. Furniture, the outline of a window, the approximate location of a door. Then the second stage begins. The rods take over. And rods are, there's no clean metaphor for this that doesn't oversimplify, they're a different instrument entirely. They live mostly in the peripheral retina, they don't process colour, and they are extraordinarily sensitive to low levels of light. So sensitive that a fully dark adapted rod can theoretically respond to a single photon. But they need time to get there. The photopigment in rods, rhodopsin, takes longer to regenerate than cone pigments do, and until it does, the rod system is operating below its potential. This is why in a dim room, your peripheral vision works better than your central vision for a while. Why looking slightly to the side of a faint star makes it appear brighter than looking directly at it. The rods are out there, in the periphery, more ready than the cones at the center are. Your eye knows this in the sense that biological systems can be said to know things, which is to say, it's structured to use it, even if nothing conscious is directing the strategy. The cold side of the pillow, if there is one, has probably warmed by now, that specific temperature that sheets reach when a body has been against them long enough, not warm exactly, just no longer cool. Now, the dim room. What's happening to the pupil in all of this is the part that tends to get treated as the whole story, and it isn't. The pupil dilates. Yes, the dilator pupillae contracts. The sphincter pupillae releases some of its resting tone. The aperture widens to let in more light. This happens relatively quickly, within seconds of entering the dim space. But the pupil dilating is just one piece of an adjustment that involves the entire phototransduction system. The regeneration of photopigments, changes in the gain of the retinal circuitry, and shifts in which cell populations the visual system is primarily relying on. The pupil opens the door. The rest of the eye redecorates the room. And here's the part that feels most immediate, most personal, in the transition window, when the rods aren't fully adapted and the cones are losing their advantage in the low light. The visual system is genuinely between 2 states. Not broken, not failing. Just caught mid-shift between 2 different ways of seeing. The world looks flatter in that window. Edges are softer. Colours go grey or near grey. Depth becomes approximate. You're briefly seeing the way a different version of your visual system sees all the time, and then it passes. The rods come up. The room settles into its dim but legible version of itself. The eye stops announcing the transition and just gets on with whatever comes next. The closing of the day, the dimming of rooms, the slow biological negotiation between what the eye was doing an hour ago and what it's being asked to do now. This is a transition that happens every single night in some form without you managing any of it. You just walk into the dim room, the eye handles the rest. The autonomic nervous system doesn't ask for permission. It didn't this morning when it adjusted your heart rate before you were fully awake. It didn't last week when it shifted blood flow in response to something stressful before you'd even consciously registered the stress. It isn't asking now. Somewhere above the orbit of your eye, a branch of this system has already decided, how much tension the ciliary muscle should carry tonight. You weren't consulted. The ciliary muscle receives its parasympathetic drive through the oculomotor nerve, the third cranial nerve, which also controls most of the muscles that move the eyeball itself. The parasympathetic fibers branch off, relay through the ciliary ganglion, and arrive at the ciliary muscle with instructions that come ultimately from a region of the brainstem called the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. This nucleus receives input from multiple sources: the protectal area, which processes light levels, cortical regions involved in attention and near-focus demand, and pathways that carry information about the body's broader physiological state. That last part is the one worth staying with. The ciliary muscle doesn't just respond to what the eye is looking at, it responds to what the nervous system is doing overall. When sympathetic tone is elevated, when the body is running some version of its alert state, even a mild, chronic, barely noticeable version, the balance of autonomic input to the eye shifts. The parasympathetic drive that would normally allow the ciliary muscle to release becomes relatively suppressed. The muscle holds more than it would in genuine calm. This is not a flaw in the design, it's the design. An alert animal needs its visual system primed for near-range detail, for sudden changes, for threats that could appear close. Keeping the ciliary muscle in a slightly contracted state keeps the eye ready for near focus. What serves an animal in intermittent danger becomes, in a human living with sustained low-grade stress, a form of tension that doesn't have a clear release event. The signal that should say relax now doesn't come, or it comes too briefly, too infrequently to allow the muscle to return fully to baseline. There's a word for this kind of chronic low-level muscular holding, accommodative spasm in its more pronounced forms. But even below the clinical threshold, the ciliary muscle in a chronically stressed eye is carrying more tone than the eye strictly requires. The lens sits in a slightly thickened state. Near objects are clear. Distance vision is subtly, often imperceptibly compromised. The floor of the room you're in probably has a temperature you've never thought about once. Floors just exist. But right now, if your feet were on it, it would be cooler than the air a few inches above it, cooler than the surface of any blanket, the kind of temperature that only registers when you've been still enough for the room to stop feeling like background. What stands out most in the research on accommodative tone, and this is a preference more than a conclusion, a detail that seems to carry more weight than it's usually given, is the relationship between sustained near work and what researchers have begun calling the near work myopogenesis hypothesis. The idea, still being characterized rather than fully settled, is that sustained ciliary muscle contraction during childhood and adolescence may send signals to the sclera, the outer coat of the eye, that influence axial growth, that the eye, in other words, may grow slightly longer in response to chronic near-focus demand. Not because the muscle damages the sclera, because it signals it. The The sclera contains cells called scleral fibroblasts, and these cells respond to biochemical signals from the retina and choroid, signals that encode information about whether the eye is focused correctly on the objects in front of it. When the eye is consistently focused at near distances, those signals shift. The choroid thins slightly, the sclera receives less of certain growth-inhibiting factors, and the eye, following instructions nobody consciously issued, adjusts its axial length in the direction that would make near focus easier. It doesn't ask whether this is a good idea in the long run. Biological systems optimize for the present conditions. The past, the hours of reading, the years of screen work, accumulates as a kind of cellular memory in the tissue. Not memory in any cognitive sense, just the physical record of what was asked of the eye, written into its dimensions. The ciliary muscle carries part of that record too in its resting tone. A muscle that has spent years contracting frequently for near work develops a baseline that sits higher than it would have otherwise. This isn't irreversible, not entirely. The autonomic nervous system retains its capacity to shift, and there is evidence that time spent outdoors, with the eye focusing at distance or at nothing in particular, allows some of this tone to dissipate. But dissipation takes time, longer than a day, sometimes longer than a week of changed habits. Tonight the eye is resting. The screen is off or dim. There is no near target demanding accommodation. The parasympathetic input to the ciliary muscle is dropping as the body moves towards sleep, the Edinger-Westphal nucleus receiving less drive from cortical attention systems that are themselves beginning to quiet. The muscle is releasing, slowly without announcement, in the same way accumulated tension, gradually, below the threshold of anything you'd call a feeling. What stands out sitting with this is not the tension itself, but the patience of the process. The ciliary muscle didn't tighten in a day. It won't fully release in a night. The body works on timescales that don't match the timescales humans tend to think in. Not hours, not even days, but the slow accumulation of many ordinary moments, each one unremarkable, each one adding to or subtracting from a baseline that shifts so gradually it never announces itself as having changed. By morning, the muscle will have released more than it has now. That's enough for tonight. You know the feeling of putting something down after carrying it for a long time, not a dramatic weight, something ordinary, a bag, a book, a child who fell asleep on your shoulder. The relief isn't sharp. It's more like a slow realization that your muscles were doing something they no longer have to do. The shoulder drops a fraction, the arm finds a different angle, and only in the absence of the effort do you understand how continuous it was. The ciliary muscle doesn't get that moment of realization. It has no equivalent of the bag hitting the floor. When the effort stops, when you finally look up from the page, or close the laptop, or let your eyes go unfocused in the dim of a room winding down, the release is real, but it's quiet, gradual, and in many eyes, after a day of sustained near work, not entirely complete. Accommodation is the word for what the eye does when it adjusts focus for distance. The ciliary muscle contracts, the zonular fibers that suspend the lens go slack, and the lens, freed from the outward tension those fibers normally exert, rounds up, thickens, increases its refractive power. Close things come sharp. The whole process takes less than a second. It's one of the faster things the body does without thinking, and it happens so fluidly, so below the surface of experience that most people never once feel it happening. What most people do eventually feel is what happens when it's been happening for hours. There's a texture to end-of-day vision that's worth naming, because it's so common and so rarely attributed to its actual cause. Things at distance look slightly soft. Not blurry enough to be alarming, just not quite as crisp as they were this morning. A road sign takes a beat longer to read. A face across the room is recognizable but not detailed. The eye is technically working, it's doing everything you ask of it. It's just doing it from a position that's shifted slightly from where it started. The ciliary muscle, after hours of contraction, hasn't fully let go. This is accommodative lag, a measurable documented delay in the muscle's return to its resting state after sustained near work. The lens is still sitting a little rounder than it needs to be for distance. The zonular fibers are still a little slacker than they'd be in a fully relaxed eye. And none of this crosses the threshold of pain or obvious dysfunction, which is exactly why it goes unnoticed most of the time. The interesting thing, and this took a while to sit with properly, is that this lag isn't random. It follows a pattern. The longer the near work session, the more pronounced the lag. The closer the working distance, the stronger the ciliary muscle contraction required, and the longer it tends to persist afterward. Young eyes, with their more flexible lenses and more responsive ciliary muscles, can accumulate lag faster than older eyes, not because they're weaker, but because they're capable of stronger accommodation in the first place, which means they can sustain higher levels of muscular effort for longer before something starts to drift. A child reading for 3 hours is working that muscle harder than an adult doing the same thing. The adult's lens is already stiffer, already less responsive to ciliary force, which in this one narrow sense is a kind of protection. There's less range of motion, which means less range to get stuck in. Outside, or maybe just in the distance somewhere, there might be the sound of a car passing. One of those sounds that arrives, crosses, and fades in about 4 seconds, long enough to notice, short enough that it's already gone by the time you've decided whether it was worth attending to. Accommodation also involves the pupil, which isn't always mentioned in simple accounts of near focus. When the ciliary muscle contracts for near work, the pupil constricts slightly as part of the same response, a triad of changes that includes accommodation, convergence of the two eyes toward the near target, and pupil constriction. These three happen together, linked by shared neural pathways, even though they involve different muscles in different structures. The constriction during near work increases depth of field, which reduces the precision required from accommodation to produce a clear image. The eye is, in this sense, covering its own margins. The habit of holding, which is what accommodative lag really is, the ciliary muscle maintaining the posture of effort after the effort is technically over, is not pathological in its mild everyday form. It's just what muscles do when they've been working. The question of whether it becomes something more than that over years of sustained near work, particularly during the developmental period when the eye is still establishing its baseline, is one that researchers are still working through. The data is accumulating. The picture is not entirely settled. What is settled is the nightly reset. During sleep, the ciliary muscle receives almost no accommodative drive. The Edina-Westphal nucleus quiets. The parasympathetic input that sustains ciliary contraction drops substantially. The lens, freed from the signal to thicken, drifts toward its flattest natural shape. The zonular fibers, pulled taut again by the reduced ciliary tone, hold the lens in at least accommodated position. By morning, the lag from the previous day is largely gone. The eye comes back to approximately where it started. The baseline reasserts itself, and the day's accumulation of effort dissolves in the hours you spent not looking at anything. This happens every night. It's been happening every night of your life, quietly, without any effort on your part. The eye holds through the day and releases through the night, accumulates and resets, tightens and softens, and carries you from one morning to the next without ever asking whether you noticed. You didn't have to do anything for this. You just had to sleep. Something shifts in the eye around mid-afternoon, not dramatically, nothing you'd point to and say, That's when it happened. It's more like a gradual loosening of precision, the kind of thing you notice only when you realize you've been rereading the same sentence twice, or that a face across the room is taking a beat longer to resolve into something legible. The eye hasn't broken, it's just carrying the day. What's happening isn't located in any single structure. That's the part I find most interesting about visual fatigue. It isn't one thing failing, it's several things each becoming slightly less accurate at the same time. They're small individual drifts compounding into something that feels unified, but isn't. The extraocular muscles, the 6 muscles attached to the outside of each eyeball that control where the eye points, have been making tiny corrections all day. Microsaccades, the researchers call them. Small involuntary jerks of the eye that keep the image from fading due to neural adaptation. The visual system needs movement to maintain a stable image, which is a strange design when you think about it. Stillness for the eye produces fading, so the eye never truly holds still. It trembles constantly in movements too small to feel. By late afternoon, the precision of those corrections degrades slightly. Not enough to cause obvious problems, just enough that the image is being stabilized with a little less accuracy than it was this morning. And then there's the convergence system. When you look at something close, both eyes rotate inward to point at the same target. Convergence. Maintaining this for extended periods requires sustained effort from the medial rectus muscles on both sides. After hours of near work, convergence becomes effortful in a way it wasn't at the start of the day. The eyes still converge. But there's a sluggishness to it, a slightly longer lag between the demand and the response. This is sometimes called convergence insufficiency when it becomes chronic. But even in healthy eyes after a long day, there's a milder version of this same drag. The muscles are responsive but tired in the particular way that smooth and striated muscle gets tired, not through the dramatic failure of a sprinted leg, but through a slow accumulation of small inefficiencies. Somewhere nearby there's probably the sound of something settling, a house cooling, a building contracting slightly in the drop of evening temperature. One of those sounds so ordinary it's almost below the threshold of sound, more like pressure than noise. The retina gets involved too. Photoreceptors don't fatigue the way muscles do, but they do deplete. The photopigments, rhodopsin in rods, the conopsins in cones, bleach when they absorb light and must be regenerated before they can respond again. Under normal conditions, regeneration keeps pace with bleaching, but under sustained highlight conditions or after very long periods of visual demand, the balance can shift, not dramatically, not to the point of obvious dysfunction, just enough that the retinal response to incoming light is fractionally slower, fractionally less sensitive than it was earlier. The image the brain is working with by late afternoon has travelled through a slightly more tired set of sensors. The brain compensates mostly. It's very good at compensating. But compensation has its own cost. Extra processing, more effort spent on what was once automatic, a background expenditure of resources that accumulates across the day without being visible as any single identifiable strain. I tend to think this is why late afternoon light often feels different, even when the actual light hasn't changed much. The angle shifts, yes, the warmth of the spectrum shifts, but some of what feels different might also be the eye itself, processing the same photons through a system that's been running since morning, that's been correcting and adjusting and compensating for hours, and is now doing all of that with just slightly less margin than it started with. That's just a thought, not a conclusion. The signals travelling from the eye to the brain, along the optic nerve, through the lateral geniculate nucleus into the visual cortex, don't slow down with fatigue the way you might expect. The nerve conduction velocity stays relatively stable. What changes is what happens at the processing end. The visual cortex and the areas that handle attention, depth, motion, face recognition. These are metabolically expensive regions, and they've been working all day. Their responses become slightly less sharp. The thresholds for detection shift. What the brain decides to attend to and how quickly it processes what it attends to changes in ways that don't announce themselves as fatigue but probably are. The eye isn't working alone. It never was. By now, lying here, your eyes have probably been closed for a while, or nearly closed, or drifting in that particular unfocused way that happens in the space just before sleep, where the visual system is technically still running, but not really doing anything purposeful with what it receives. The extraocular muscles are still, or close to it. The convergent system has nothing to converge on. The photopigments are regenerating in the dark quietly, at the pace they prefer when nobody is asking them to do anything. The day's accumulation of small corrections and minor compensations and sustained low-level effort is dissolving into something that doesn't have a clean biological name, but feels, from the inside, like the specific relief of not having to see anything for a while. The pupil has no opinion. It doesn't decide to widen or narrow. It doesn't weigh the situation. It receives signals from two competing branches of the autonomic nervous system and ends up at whatever diameter those signals, in their combined and opposing pressure, happen to produce. The pupil is the outcome of an argument it isn't part of. The parasympathetic branch, the one associated with rest, digestion, the slower rhythms of the body not under threat, drives the sphincter pupillae to contract. Smaller pupil, the sympathetic branch associated with alertness, readiness, the body's preparation for demand, drives the dilator pupillae to pull the pupil or wide, larger pupil. Both branches are always active, always sending some level of signal, and the pupil sits at the intersection of whatever those levels happen to be at any given moment. This is called reciprocal innervation, and the eye is one of the cleaner examples of it in the body. In genuine calm, the kind that follows a long exhale, the kind that settles over a body that has been still and warm and undisturbed for a stretch of time, the parasympathetic branch carries more weight. The sphincter gets more drive, the pupil sits smaller, not fully constricted, never that, but closer to the constricted end of its range. The eye, in this state, is an eye that isn't preparing for anything. That state is rarer than it sounds. The sympathetic nervous system in a modern human tends to carry a low background hum of activity that doesn't correspond to any specific threat or demand, but exists anyway. A residue of cognitive load, of unresolved tasks, of the particular kind of tiredness that comes not from physical exertion, but from sustained mental activity that never quite reached a conclusion. Under these conditions, the sympathetic branch contributes more than it would in genuine rest. The dilator gets more drive. The pupil sits fractionally wider than calm would produce. Not wide enough to notice, not wide enough to feel, but measurably, documentably wider than baseline. There's a technique called pupillometry, the precise measurement of pupil diameter over time, that researchers use partly because the pupil is such a clean readout of autonomic state. You can watch the pupil and infer something about what the nervous system is doing. When cognitive load increases, the pupil dilates slightly. When a problem becomes harder, the dilation is larger. When the answer arrives, the pupil contracts back. None of this is under voluntary control. The pupil is, in this sense, one of the more honest things about a person. The room has probably settled around you by now. Whatever temperature it was when you started listening, it's stable now. The kind of stable that rooms reach when the people in them stop generating heat through movement, when the air stops being disturbed, when everything just sits in its own temperature and stops changing. The relationship between sustained stress and pupil diameter is real but not dramatic. It's not that a stressed person walks around with visibly dilated pupils. The difference between a calm pupil and a chronically sympathetically driven pupil might be less than 0.5 millimeter in ordinary light conditions. You would never see it without instruments. The person carrying it wouldn't feel it. But the underlying dynamic, more sympathetic drive, more dilator activity, the sphincter working against a stronger opposing force, is present in the tissue, playing out in every moment. What isn't entirely clear is what this costs over years. The dilator pupillae is smooth muscle, like the sphincter, and smooth muscle has a different relationship to sustained effort than skeletal muscle does. It doesn't fatigue in the acute dramatic way that a sprinted leg fatigues. It can maintain contraction for extraordinarily long periods without the kind of metabolic debt that would force rest. But the assumption that smooth muscle can sustain anything indefinitely without consequence is probably too clean. The biology of chronic smooth muscle activation is complicated, and in organs other than the eye, sustained sympathetic drive to smooth muscle is associated with structural changes over time, thickening, stiffening, altered responsiveness. Whether the dilator pupillae undergoes anything analogous over decades of elevated sympathetic tone isn't something that's been thoroughly studied. The honest answer is that it's not well characterized. The eye has been studied intensively for its optical properties and its role in disease, and rather less for the long-term behavior of its smaller muscular components under varying autonomic conditions. That gap feels worth noting, even without being able to fill it. What is clear is the direction of travel tonight. As the body moves towards sleep, the sympathetic nervous system begins to quiet. Not all at once. It steps down gradually through the stages of pre-sleep relaxation, pulled down partly by circadian signals, partly by the drop in cortisol that occurs in the evening, partly by the simple withdrawal of the environmental demands that were keeping it elevate. The parasympathetic branch correspondingly begins to carry more relative weight. The pupil responds, slowly in increments too small to track without instruments, moves toward its more constricted resting position. The dilator is receiving less drive. The sphincter's resting tone becomes the more dominant force. The argument, for now, is settling in one direction, and the eye, without being asked, without deciding, without any awareness of what it's doing or why, moves incrementally towards something that at least resembles rest. The argument doesn't end, it just gets quieter. There is a version of your eye that existed 20 years ago, or 10, or 30, depending on where you are in a life, that could open wider than it can tonight, not dramatically wider, not in a way that would have been visible in a photograph or that anyone would have commented on, but measurably wider. The dilator pupillae was more responsive then. The tissue was younger in the specific way that smooth muscle tissue is younger, more elastic, more willing to reach toward its full range, less accustomed to the particular resting position it has slowly, over years, settled into. This is called meiosis of aging, though that term tends to get used for the more pronounced version, the obvious pupil constriction that becomes visible in the elderly. What's less often discussed is the gradual, decades-long drift that precedes that. The slow narrowing of the pupil's maximum diameter that happens so incrementally across so many years that no single night contains enough change to notice. The dilator pupillae starts this drift early, earlier than most people would guess. Maximum pupil diameter, the widest the pupil can open under complete darkness, with the eye fully dark adapted, peaks somewhere in adolescence. In a teenager's eye, the fully dilated pupil can reach 8, sometimes 9 millimeters in diameter. By the 30s, this maximum has already begun to contract. By the 50s, the maximum dilation in darkness might sit closer to 5 millimeters. The pupil still dilates, still responds to low light, but the ceiling of its range has descended, quietly without announcement, across the intervening decades. The dilator muscle itself changes. The muscle fibers lose some of their elasticity. The iris stroma, the connective tissue in which the dilator fibers are embedded, becomes less pliable, slightly less willing to stretch toward its outer limits. And the autonomic innervation of the dilator, which relies on sympathetic fibers from the superior cervical ganglion, becomes somewhat less robust with age. The signal arrives, but the tissue responds with a little less amplitude than it once did. There's something in this that stands out more than the mechanics, not the numbers, not the millimeters, but the fact that the eye is tracking time in this way at all, writing age into its range of motion. The pupil's maximum diameter is, in a quiet sense, a record, not of anything dramatic, just of years. Night driving is often where people first notice something has shifted, not as a clear problem usually, more as a vague sense that oncoming headlights are harder than they used to be, that the pools of darkness between streetlights are less legible than they were. The eye is doing what it always does in low light, dilating, activating the rod system, increasing sensitivity where it can. But the dilation isn't reaching as far as it once did. The aperture is smaller. Less light is reaching the retina per unit of time. The rod system, which depends on the retina receiving enough photons to generate a reliable signal, is working with a smaller budget. Glasses can correct refractive error. They don't correct pupil range, the wet, cold smell of night air through a cracked window, the specific version that arrives after rain, carrying something green underneath it. That's one of those sensory details that has nothing to do with any of this but exists anyway, in the room or near it, the kind of thing that's easy to miss until the mind gets quiet enough to notice it. The crystalline lens plays a role in this too, and the two processes, lens yellowing and pupil meiosis, tend to accumulate simultaneously, compounding each other's effect on low-light vision. The aging lens absorbs more short-wavelength light, more blue, more violet, filtered out before it reaches the retina. The retina receives a warmer, more orange-shifted spectrum than it once did. Combined with a smaller maximum pupil diameter, the low-light visual experience in an older eye is genuinely different from that of a younger eye. Not broken, not diseased, just operating with a different set of constraints than it started with. The body records its own age in its ranges, in the range of joint motion, in the maximum heart rate achievable before the cardiovascular system calls for rest, in the flexibility of the lens, and here, in the ceiling of the pupil's dilation, in how wide the eye is willing to go in the dark, in how much night it's prepared to let in. What stands out most sitting with this is not the loss of range, but the patience of the process. It doesn't happen in a year. It doesn't happen in 5. It happens across decades in increments so small that the eye adjusts its expectations continuously, without ever registering a single night as the night things changed. You don't remember your pupils being wider. The eye you have now is the only eye you have access to. And tonight, in whatever darkness you're lying in, the dilator is doing what it can, pulling the pupil toward its current ceiling, letting in what light there is, handing the signal to the rods and asking them to do the rest. It's not the widest it has ever been, but it's still opening. The lens doesn't know it's a lens. It has no nerves, no blood supply, no direct connection to anything that would allow it to receive information about what it's doing or why. It sits suspended in the eye by a ring of fine fibers, the zonules, and it changes shape because the muscle around it either squeezes or doesn't. That's the entirety of its relationship with the rest of the body. Passive, responsive, entirely dependent on forces it cannot feel. There's something almost restful about that. The zonular fibers attach to the equator of the lens, the widest part of the middle, and run outward to the ciliary body, where the ciliary muscle lives. In the resting eye, when the ciliary muscle is not contracting, these fibers are under tension. They pull the lens outward, toward its edges, flattening it. The lens in this state is at its thinnest, its least curved, its least powerful refractive state. Distance vision, the default. When the ciliary muscle contracts, which it does for near focus, pulling the ciliary body inward and forward, reducing the diameter of the ring, the zonular fibers go slack. The tension releases, and the lens, freed from the outward pull it was under, rounds up, thickens, its surfaces become more curved, its refractive power increases, near things come sharp. The lens doesn't do this, it allows it to happen. The distinction feels small but isn't. The lens is not an active participant in accommodation, it's a material, a biological material with particular elastic properties that deforms under force and returns to shape when the force is removed. Or it did once, when it was young enough to still be elastic. The human lens grows throughout life, not by the same mechanism as most tissues. It doesn't shed old cells and replace them. Instead, new fiber cells are laid down continuously at the periphery, compressing the older cells toward the center, where they eventually lose their nuclei and organelles entirely and become the dense, transparent core of the lens. This core, called the nucleus, accumulates over a lifetime, gets denser, gets larger relative to the whole lens, gets stiffer. A 20-year-old lens has a relatively small soft nucleus surrounded by a more elastic cortex. It deforms readily under ciliary muscle force. A 50-year-old lens has a larger, denser nucleus that resists deformation. The ciliary muscle can contract with the same force it always had, for a while at least, but the lens no longer responds with the same amplitude of shape change. The material has changed, not the mechanism. The material. The weight of a blanket, when it's the right weight, has a specific quality that's hard to describe without overselling it, not heavy enough to feel trapped, just present enough to feel contained. That's a different kind of pressure than the eye's internal pressures, but the body seems to respond to both in loosely similar ways, with something that isn't quite relief, but is in the same neighborhood. What's quietly interesting about the lens is its transparency. Most biological tissues are opaque. Cells contain organelles, pigments, structures that scatter light. The lens fiber cells, in eliminating their organelles as they mature, sacrifice almost everything a cell normally contains in order to become optically clear. It's a strange bargain. The cell essentially hollows itself out, gives up the machinery of being a cell, in order to serve a function that has nothing to do with cellular activity. The oldest lens cells at the center of the nucleus have been there since before you were born, not maintained, not replaced, just compressed, clarified, and held. They are among the longest-lived cells in the body, possibly the longest-lived organized cellular structures you carry, if you can even call them cells anymore in any functional sense. What sits at the center of your lens is a remnant of something that formed in the first weeks of your existence and has been accumulating layers around it ever since, like sediment around a stone that stopped being a stone a long time ago. Tonight, with no near target, no demand for accommodation, the ciliary muscle at its quietest, the zonular fibers are under what tension they carry at rest, and the lens is sitting in its flattest available shape. Not the flattest it has ever been in your life, probably flatter than it was an hour ago, when the day's residual accommodative tone was still dissipating. Just sitting there, suspended, transparent, shaped by what the muscle around it is doing or not doing. Carrying at its center something older than almost any other structure you have, compressed into density and stillness, doing nothing now but allowing light to pass through, which, given everything, is enough. There is a kind of stillness that can only be created chemically, not the stillness of sleep, where the body quiets by degrees, following rhythms it has followed every night of its existence. Not the stillness of rest, where muscles reduce their activity without stopping it entirely. Something more absolute than either of those, a pharmacological stillness, imposed from outside that removes the ciliary muscle from the conversation entirely and leaves the eye in a state it would never reach on its own. This is cycloplegia, and the experience of it, for the people who've had it, tends to be more disorienting than anyone warns them it will be. The drops go in, typically atropine or a shorter-acting agent like cyclopentolate, and within minutes the parasympathetic fibres driving the ciliary muscle are blocked. The acetylcholine released at the nerve terminals can no longer bind to the muscle receptors. The signal arrives and finds nothing to receive it. The ciliary muscle, deprived of its parasympathetic drive, stops contracting. Completely. Not the partial relaxation of a resting eye, not the reduced tone of a sleepy eye. A full cessation of ciliary activity. The zonular fibres, no longer slackened by ciliary contraction, pull the lens into its flattest possible shape. Maximum tension on the zonules, minimum curvature of the lens. The eye is locked, actually locked, not figuratively, at its furthest focal point. And then you try to read something. The words are, "There's not a clean way to describe this without resorting to something that sounds like exaggeration but isn't." The words are gone. Not blurry in the ordinary sense, the way things blur when you take off glasses or squint in bad light. Gone in the way that suggests the mechanism responsible for making them legible simply isn't present anymore. The ciliary muscle, which normally responds to blur with an immediate corrective contraction, is sitting there receiving signals it cannot act on. The lens sits flat. The near object stays unresolvable. The eye cannot do what it has done automatically without effort or awareness for every moment of near vision in your entire life. It's only in the absence that you understand what was always there. The extended metaphor that keeps arriving here, and only goes so far to hold it loosely, is a key that has always been in the lock. You've never thought about the key because the door always opened. The key was just part of how doors worked. And then one afternoon, for a few hours, the lock is changed. The key is still there, you're still turning it. The door doesn't move, and in that stillness, in the specific frustration of a mechanism that refuses to engage, you understand for the first time that there was a mechanism, that the ease of before was not the absence of process, but the presence of process running smoothly enough to be invisible. The metaphor ends there, because the eye is not a door and the ciliary muscle is not a key, and the analogy starts to constrain more than it illuminates if you push it further. What cycloplegia is actually used for clinically is refraction, measuring the eye's true refractive error without the interference of the ciliary muscle's accommodative tone. In younger patients especially, the ciliary muscle at rest is never truly at rest. It maintains some residual contraction that slightly alters the lens curvature and therefore slightly alters the apparent refractive state of the eye. If you measure the prescription without paralyzing the muscle, you may be measuring a combination of the eye's actual optics and the muscle's habitual holding. Cycloplegia strips that out. You're left with the eye's structural refractive state, uncontaminated by muscular activity. This matters most in children, whose ciliary muscles are strong and whose accommodative tone can be high enough to mask significant farsightedness. A child who appears to have nearly normal vision might, under cycloplegia, reveal a substantial hyperopic prescription that the ciliary muscle has been compensating for, automatically, all day, every day, without the child ever experiencing it as effort. There's something in that detail that keeps snagging. The idea that a child could be doing sustained muscular work without feeling it as work. That the body could be compensating continuously for a structural mismatch. And the compensation could be so efficient that it registers as nothing at all. The stillness of the room right now is a different kind of stillness than cycloplegia produces. This is volitional or near volitional. The stillness that comes from choosing to lie down, from letting the day's demands recede, from giving the nervous system less to respond to. The ciliary muscle is still active, still receiving signals, still making tiny adjustments to a visual field that is mostly darkness and the vague shapes of a room you know well enough not to need to see clearly. But the signals are fewer, the adjustments smaller. The muscle is drifting toward the quietest version of its normal state, not the enforced silence of pharmacological blockade, but the ordinary, nightly, unannounced reduction of a system that has less and less to do as the hours move toward morning. The pupils, meanwhile, are moving in the opposite direction, widening as the cycloplegic effect that also dilates the pupil is, in this comparison, absent. The natural dilation of a darkening room, of a nervous system quieting, of eyelids that may be closing. The drops wear off in hours, sometimes half a day with the stronger agents, and when they do, when the parasympathetic signal finds its receptors again and the ciliary muscle receives its first successful instruction, the near world comes back, sharply, almost surprisingly. The words are legible again. The mechanism has returned. It was always going to return, but for a few hours the eye knew what it was like to be without it. And that, for anyone who has experienced it, tends to permanently change how ordinary focus feels. Not dramatically, just slightly less taken for granted than it was before. Most people who wear glasses for distance think of their eyes as having something wrong with them. That framing isn't quite right. Not wrong exactly, just imprecise in a way that matters. A myopic eye isn't broken, it's an eye that grew. Specifically, it grew slightly too long, the axial length. The distance from the front of the cornea to the back of the retina ended up 1 millimeter or 2 beyond where it needed to be for light to focus cleanly on the retinal surface. Light from distant objects converges to a point just in front of the retina, instead of on it. Close objects focus correctly or close to it, because near light has a different convergence angle. The eye isn't failing at optics. It's using optics that fit a slightly different geometry than the one distance vision requires. 1 millimeter or 2, that's the difference between clear distance vision and a world that softens past arm's length. The eye starts establishing its axial length early. From birth, actually, though the most consequential period of axial growth happens in childhood and adolescence, when the eye is actively emmetropizing. Emmetropization is the process by which the developing eye calibrates its growth to match its optics, the cornea's curvature, the lens's power, so that the focal point lands on the retina. It's a feedback loop. The retina sends signals about image quality. The sclera responds by adjusting its growth rate. Normally, this results in an eye that is, by adulthood, reasonably well matched to itself, but the feedback loop can be nudged. The current thinking, still being worked out, still accumulating evidence, but now substantial enough to have influenced public health policy in several countries, is that sustained near work during the developmental period sends signals that shift the emmetropization process toward longer axial growth. Not dramatically, not in a single afternoon of reading. Across years of chronic near-focus demand, the retinal signals that regulate scleral growth appear to change in ways that favor elongation. The exact mechanism involves the retina's dopaminergic system. Dopamine, released by a specific class of retinal cells called amacrine cells, appears to act as a stop signal for axial growth. Bright outdoor light stimulates dopamine release. Sustained near work in indoor light, with the eye focused close, the retina receiving a less intense and differently distributed light signal, samban, is associated with reduced dopamine release. Less dopamine, less inhibition of growth. The eye, following the signals it receives, grows a little further than it needed to. You know the feeling of outgrowing something that used to fit, not a dramatic moment, just the gradual realization that something which once worked without thinking now requires adjustment. Shoes maybe, or a way of sleeping that stopped being comfortable somewhere along the way without your noticing when. The eye doesn't know it's outgrowing anything, it's just responding to signals. The signals said grow. It grew. By the time the prescription appears, by the time the letters on the board start softening at the back of a classroom, the shape is already set. The sclera has already accommodated the axial length it was told to accommodate. The growth that produced the myopia happened sensibly over months or years in tissue that has no sensation, following instructions from a retina that was only ever trying to see clearly. There is a detail in this that doesn't get mentioned often enough. The myopic eye, in most cases, sees near objects perfectly well, better even than an emmetropic eye of the same age, because the focal length is matched for close distances. A myopic person reading without glasses is using their eye exactly as it was shaped to be used. The eye isn't malfunctioning, it's functioning correctly for the environment it apparently expected to be in. The glass is correct for the environment it's actually in. The cellular memory here is literal. The scleral fibroblasts that responded to those early retinal signals are still there, maintaining the collagen matrix that gives the eye its shape. The axial length they established isn't going anywhere. Short of surgical intervention, the eye will remain the shape it became. The prescription reflects a history, years of a particular visual environment, translated through retinal dopaminergic signaling into millimeters of tissue growth, and that history is now structural. The soft pressure of a pillow against the side of the face, not uncomfortable, just present, is one of those physical facts that becomes noticeable when the body has been still long enough. The kind of thing that was always there but needed quiet to register. Outdoor light matters in this story, and not just because of dopamine. Bright outdoor light, even overcast outdoor light, is orders of magnitude more intense than typical indoor lighting. This intensity appears to stimulate the peripheral retina in ways that indoor light doesn't, sending stronger growth inhibitory signals to the sclera across a wider retinal area. Children who spend more time outdoors show lower rates of myopia progression in multiple large longitudinal studies. The effect isn't explained entirely by reduced near work. It appears to be the light itself, independent of what the child is doing while in it. The eye, in other words, may have needed something that the indoor life of the last few generations didn't provide enough of. That's not a blame. It's just what the data keeps suggesting. Tonight in the dark, there's no light reaching the retina worth mentioning. The dopaminergic amacrine cells are quiet. The scleral fibroblasts are doing whatever maintenance work they do during the night. Not growing, not in the adult eye, not in any meaningful way. Just maintaining, keeping the matrix intact. Holding the shape that was decided years ago by signals that arrived in a particular order, at a particular intensity, during a window of development that is now long closed. The eye you have now is the record of that window, and it sees within its range everything it needs to. You blink less when you're focused, not as a decision, not as a trade-off you have consciously made. The motor programs that coordinate blinking are simply, quietly, without asking, deprioritized when the brain decides that what you're looking at matters enough to keep watching without interruption. The average blink rate in relaxed, unfocused conditions is somewhere between 15 and 20 blinks per minute. During reading it drops. During screen use it drops further. Studies have recorded rates as low as 3 to 5 blinks per minute in people absorbed in a task on a screen. 3 to 5. Where there were 17, there are now 4. That's a lot of blinks that didn't happen. Each blink does several things simultaneously. It spreads the tear film, a thin, layered structure of water and lipids and mucin that coats the corneal surface, back across the eye, replenishing what has evaporated since the last blink. It clears any small debris from the ocular surface. It gives the corneal nerves a brief moment of sensory input that, over the course of a day, probably contributes to the eye's overall calibration of its own surface condition. When blinks don't come, the tear film thins. It doesn't collapse immediately. The lipid layer, the outermost component, secreted by the meibomian glands along the eyelid margins, slows evaporation, buying the tear film time, but the time it buys is measured in seconds. In a normal eye with a healthy tear film, the film begins to break up after roughly 10 seconds without a blink. A blink resets the clock. When blinks are occurring every 3 to 4 seconds, as they do in relaxed wakefulness, the tear film never gets close to its breakup point. When blinks are occurring every 12 to 20 seconds, as they might during concentrated screen use, the film has time to thin, to develop dry spots, to create a slightly irregular corneal surface that the visual system compensates for, imperfectly, effortfully, by working harder to resolve the image. The dry, gritty, slightly burning sensation that arrives after long stretches of screen work isn't eye strain in the muscular sense. Or not only that, it's the corneal surface telling you something about what happened to it in the gaps between blinks that didn't come. There's probably some faint smell in the room right now. Not unpleasant, just the particular quality of air that's been in an enclosed space for a few hours. Sheets maybe, or the specific neutral warmth of a room that's been occupied and still. One of those smells that only registers when you're not doing anything else with your attention. The trigeminal nerve, the fifth cranial nerve, with branches extending throughout the face, innervates the cornea more densely than almost any other tissue in the body. The cornea is, per unit area, among the most sensitively innervated surfaces you have. This density is presumably protective. The eye is vulnerable, and the cornea sits right at its front, unshielded, and so the nervous system has placed an enormous number of sensory fibers there to detect anything that might threaten it. When the corneal surface dries, when the tear film thins and the epithelial cells beneath begin to experience the osmotic stress of increased tear film osmolarity, those fibers respond. They send signals that are interpreted as discomfort, as the urge to blink, as the sensation that something is in the eye even when nothing is. The eye is, in its way, asking for what it needs. The blink reflex under these conditions becomes more forceful when it finally arrives. Stronger lid closure, more complete tear film spread, the body overcompensating slightly for the deficit it's been accumulating. I find it quietly strange, and this is just a personal reaction to the biology, not a conclusion, that something as simple as a blink can be overridden by attention, that the brain, in allocating resources to the task of watching, will reduce the frequency of a protective reflex that the eye demonstrably needs. The eye is suffering a small reversible harm, and the brain is aware of it in some sense. The corneal signals are arriving, and still it deprioritizes the blink because the task of seeing clearly is, in this hierarchy, more urgent than the task of keeping the surface intact. Which is probably fine over an afternoon. Across years, the picture gets murkier. Chronic dry eye, the clinical condition where the tear film is persistently inadequate, affects a substantial portion of the adult population, and its incidence has been rising alongside screen use time. The causality is hard to isolate perfectly, but the mechanism is not mysterious. Fewer blinks, thinner tear film, more corneal surface stress. more inflammatory signaling, gradual changes to the meibomian glands whose oil output is essential for tear film stability. The eye was not designed in any intentional sense, but in the sense that evolution shaped it for the sustained, motionless, close-range visual tasks that dominate modern waking hours. The blink rate that evolution landed on was calibrated, presumably, for a visual life that involved more distance, more movement, more variation in where the eyes were pointing and for how long. 3 to 5 blinks per minute wasn't part of the original arrangement. Right now, your blink rate is probably normal, or higher than normal, eyes closed or nearly closed, the tear film undisturbed, the corneal surface sitting under its intact lipid layer, the meibomian glands not being asked to do anything urgent. The blinks that didn't come today don't matter much tomorrow. The cornea will resurface, the tear film will stabilize overnight. The meibomian glands will continue their slow, continuous secretion along the lid margins, replenishing the lipid reservoir that protects the eye's surface through another day of looking at things closely without remembering to blink. By morning, the surface will be ready again for another day of paying attention to things that make you forget to blink. If you've ever looked closely at an iris, your own in a mirror, or someone else's in good light, the kind of sat unromantic light that shows things as they actually are rather than as they appear in low warmth, you will have noticed that it isn't a smooth surface, that it has a geography to it, a system of ridges and furrows and crypts and collarettes that makes it look less like a simple coloured disc and more like something that was compressed and folded into its current shape by forces that didn't particularly care about aesthetics. That's almost exactly what happened. The iris forms during fetal development from tissue of mixed origin, neural crest cells migrating from the back of the developing brain and cells from the optic cup itself, and as it grows forward from the rim of the optic cup, pulling itself into position over the months before birth, the tissue folds and creases in response to the mechanical forces acting on it, the differential growth rates of its various layers, the early contractions of the muscle fibers that are already forming within it, already practicing the movements they'll make for a lifetime before there is any light to respond to. The crypts, the small pits and depressions scattered across the iris surface, form where the underlying tissue is thinner, where the stroma has less density, where the surface has been pulled inwards by the architecture below. The furrows, concentric rings that run roughly parallel to the pupil margin, form where the iris folds when it contracts, accommodation furrows and contraction furrows marking the places where the tissue reliably creases when the pupil narrows, which is to say they are the permanent record of a movement the iris has made so many times that the crease became structural. This is the part that it's not entirely clear how to say this without it sounding more significant than it probably is, the part that keeps feeling worth returning to. The texture of the iris is the accumulated record of its own movement. The folds are where the folds have always been. The crypts are the topography of the tissue's internal architecture, made visible at the surface. What you see when you look at an iris is not decoration. It is history, rendered structurally, in the specific pattern that this particular tissue arrived at through this particular developmental sequence and then preserved through decades of repeated motion. No two irises go through the same developmental sequence in the same way. Not even in identical twins, whose genetic instructions for iris development are the same, but whose intrauterine environments, the precise mechanical forces, the exact timing of neural crest cell migration, the local variation in tissue tension during the weeks of iris formation, are never perfectly identical. The pattern that results is therefore genuinely unique. Not unique in the loose way that faces are unique, where the same features recur in different combinations, but unique in a more granular sense. The specific location of each crypt, the exact path of each furrow, the precise arrangement of the collarette where the sphincter and dilator territories meet, these are the product of a developmental process sensitive enough to environmental variation that it never produces the same output twice. This is why iris recognition works as a biometric. Not because someone designed an iris to be identifying, but because the developmental process that produces irises is variable enough, and the tissue stable enough once formed, that the pattern functions as an identifier without ever having been intended as one. Somewhere in the house, maybe in the walls, maybe in the ceiling, there's probably a faint tick, not a clock necessarily, just the sound of something expanding or contracting with the temperature, the kind of sound that a house makes in the night when the people in it are quiet enough to stop covering it with their own noise. The dilator pupillae and the sphincter pupillae are both smooth muscles embedded within the iris stroma, and their arrangement, the radial fibers of the dilator, the circumferential ring of the sphincter, contributes to the surface texture of the iris in ways that are visible without magnification. The dilator fibers run from the iris root outward toward the pupil margin, and the radial striations you can sometimes see in a lightly pigmented iris are, at least in part, the surface expression of those underlying muscle columns. What looks like a visual pattern is partly a mechanical structure. The striae are where the muscle is. The pigmentation sits over all of this, distributed through the stromal cells and the posterior pigmented epithelium, varying in density and type between individuals and determining the colour the eye presents to the world. But the colour is, in a sense, the least structurally interesting thing about the iris. The colour can change slowly, with age or disease or medication. The structural pattern of crypts and furrows and muscle-driven striations is more stable, set earlier, less susceptible to alteration after the developmental window closes. What isn't entirely resolved, and this is a genuine gap rather than a rhetorical one, is the precise relationship between iris microstructure and health status. There are traditions, particularly in iridology, that claim detailed diagnostic information can be read from iris patterns, but the scientific evidence for this is not there in any rigorous sense, and it's worth saying so plainly. What is documented more cautiously is that certain changes in iris appearance, changes in vascularity, in pigment distribution, in the integrity of the stroma, can accompany particular systemic conditions in ways that are sometimes detectable by clinical examination. The iris has a blood supply and an immune presence and participates in inflammatory processes that can leave visible traces. But this is different from the structural pattern being a map of the body's organs, which it isn't. The pattern is a map of development, and only development. Tonight, behind closed lids, the iris is sitting in whatever state the current light level and autonomic tone have placed it. Pupil probably somewhat dilated, the sphincter holding its resting tone, the dilator receiving its quiet sympathetic signal, the surface with its crypts and furrows expressing nothing in particular, just maintaining the shape it took on before you were born and has held, with minor age-related changes ever since. The identity it carries isn't something it chose or earned, it just grew that way, under conditions it had no knowledge of, into a pattern that turned out to be singular, and then it stayed. Somewhere in your 40s, give or take a decade depending on genetics, on how hard the ciliary muscle has been working across a lifetime, on factors that haven't been fully characterized. The lens stops cooperating the way it once did. Not suddenly. That's the thing about presbyopia that makes it so hard to pinpoint in memory. There is no day it began. There is only the day you noticed it, which arrived well after the process itself had started. The lens grows denser throughout life. New fibre cells are added continuously at the periphery, the same process described earlier, the laying down of new layers over old ones, the compression of older cells toward the nucleus, the gradual elimination of cellular organelles as the fibers mature into the transparent, metabolically inert material that the lens requires to do its job. This growth never stops. The lens at 60 is physically larger than the lens at 20, denser, heavier by the small measures available to biological tissue, and stiffer. The elastic properties of the lens depend on the protein composition of its fiber cells, and those proteins change with age. The crystallins, the structural proteins that give the lens its transparency and its mechanical properties, undergo gradual modifications over decades. Cross-linking between protein molecules increases. The lens matrix becomes less deformable. Not uniformly, the outer cortex retains more elasticity than the nucleus for longer, but the trend is consistent, and it runs in one direction only. The ciliary muscle contracts, the zonular fibers slacken, and the lens, which in a younger eye would round up readily, would increase its curvature with the ease of a material that remembers how to deform, responds with decreasing amplitude. The muscle is doing its part, the lens is doing less of its part than it used to. For a while the ciliary muscle compensates. It contracts harder, pulls the ciliary body further inward, slackens the zonules more completely, gives the lens every possible mechanical advantage. People in their early 40s often don't notice any change because the muscle, still strong and responsive, is simply working harder to produce the same result it used to produce easily. But there is a limit to what force can accomplish against a material that has stopped being responsive to force. The reading glasses, when they eventually arrive, represent a recognition of that limit. The optical correction that presbyopia requires isn't correcting a disease, it's supplying externally the additional refractive power that the lens can no longer generate for itself. The light from a near object, which the lens in its youth would have bent sharply enough to focus on the retina, now needs help bending. The glasses provide that bend. The image arrives correctly. The mechanism that used to do this hasn't disappeared. The ciliary muscle is still there, still contracting on demand, still slackening the zonules with reasonable efficiency. The lens is still responding to a degree, but the degree has diminished. A radiator somewhere in a building makes a specific sound when heat moves through old pipes, a ticking almost rhythmic that arrives without warning and stops the same way. Not unpleasant, just the sound of something doing its work in the middle of the night while everything else is quiet. What stands out in the biology of presbyopia, and this is a preference, not a conclusion, is the way it exposes the collaborative nature of a system that normally hides its collaborations completely. Accommodation, when it works, is invisible. The near object is sharp. The mechanism by which it became sharp is entirely absent from experience. You never feel the ciliary muscle contracting. You never feel the lens rounding. You just see. When the collaboration starts to break down, when the muscle and the lens are no longer producing the same result from the same input, the mechanism suddenly becomes visible. Not directly. You still don't feel the ciliary muscle working harder, but you feel the output degrading. The menu held at arm's length. The text size increased on the phone. The lamp pulled closer to the page. These are all adaptations to a collaboration that is quietly failing, made without ever quite understanding what is failing or why. The eye was working as a system. The system aged as a system. And the place where the aging became noticeable was at the interface between two components, the muscle and the lens, where the mismatch between what one was providing and what the other could use gradually widened past the threshold of compensation. Presbyopia is also, in a strange way, the most universal of all the eye's age-related changes. Myopia affects a portion of the population. Cataracts, though common, don't affect everyone on the same timeline. But presbyopia, the stiffening of the lens, the loss of accommodative range, arrives in essentially every human eye that lives long enough. The timeline varies, the rate varies, the eventual degree of loss varies, but the direction is the same for everyone. There is something in that universality that feels not comforting exactly, but leveling. The lens doesn't distinguish. It grows denser in every eye. The crystallines cross-link in every lens. The amplitude of accommodation narrows in every person who ages long enough to experience it. The ciliary muscle, for its part, also changes with age. It doesn't just encounter a stiffer lens, it becomes somewhat less forceful itself as the connective tissue within it stiffens and the autonomic innervation becomes less robust. The muscle and the lens age in parallel, each becoming less capable over the same decades, the collaboration degrading on both sides simultaneously. Tonight, the ciliary muscle is resting at whatever baseline it currently holds. The lens is sitting in whatever flattest shape it can currently achieve. The years of accumulated protein cross-linking and nuclear densification are present in the tissue, as they always are, neither improving nor worsening in any way that a single night would reveal. The eye you have right now, whatever age it is, whatever stage of this process it has reached, is doing what it can with what it has, which has always been in the end what eyes do. The eyes close and something shifts, not immediately. The transition from wakefulness to sleep isn't a switch, it's a gradient. A slow withdrawal of the systems that were keeping everything alert and coordinated and pointed at something. The visual system doesn't shut down the moment the lids touch. It winds down, gradually in stages, over the first minutes after the eyes close. In the lightest stages of sleep, the eyes are still, lid closed, the extraocular muscles holding the eyeball in a roughly central position, not rigidly, just resting. The ciliary muscle receiving less and less parasympathetic drive as the Edinger-Westphal nucleus quiets with the rest of the brainstem's wakeful activity. The lens drifting slowly toward its flattest available shape, not because anything is directing it there, but because the signal to thicken has simply stopped arriving. The pupil constricts in sleep. This is one of the more consistent findings in sleep physiology, and it holds across sleep stages. The parasympathetic tone that narrows the pupil remains relatively elevated during non-REM sleep, even as many other bodily systems reduce their activity. The pupil in deep non-REM sleep is smaller than it is in wakefulness under the same light conditions. The reason isn't entirely settled, but one interpretation is that the parasympathetic dominance of deep sleep, the state sometimes described as the body's restoration mode, extends to the iris, keeping the sphincter gently engaged while the sympathetic drive that would widen the pupil is reduced. The tear film behind the closed lids does something quietly useful. During wakefulness, the tear film is constantly under threat of evaporation, constantly being replenished by blinking, constantly being disturbed by the movement of the lid across the corneal surface. In sleep, the lids are closed. The tear film is sealed in. Evaporation drops to nearly nothing. The corneal surface, which spent the day being exposed and dried and re-wetted in cycles, now sits in a stable, humid environment for hours. The ocular surface recovers. This is part of why eyes that feel dry and gritty at the end of a long day feel better in the morning. Not entirely better. In people with chronic dry eye, the underlying problem doesn't resolve overnight, but better. The hours of lid closure give the tear film a chance to redistribute, the corneal epithelium a chance to recover from the osmotic stress of a thinning film, the meibomian gland secretions a chance to soften and spread. The night is doing something the day kept interrupting. There's a coolness that settles into the air of a room in the small hours, Not cold, just the specific temperature that rooms reach when heating has cycled down and the night has been going long enough. The kind of temperature that makes a blanket feel like a decision rather than a habit. Then REM sleep arrives, and the eye changes. The extraocular muscles, which were resting, which were holding the eye in quiet stillness through the earlier stages, begin to move. Rapidly, in bursts, in the erratic pattern that gives rapid eye movements sleep its name. The movements are real muscle contractions, real rotations of the eyeball within the socket. They don't follow a target. They don't track anything in the physical environment, because the eyes are closed and the visual cortex, though active, is processing internally generated signals rather than external ones. What the eye is tracking, if anything, is dream content. The evidence for this is imperfect. Dream reports don't correlate precisely enough with eye movement direction to make the tracking hypothesis certain, but it remains the most plausible interpretation. The motor systems that normally move the eyes in wakefulness are active during REM. They produce movements that resemble, in their general character, the movements of waking vision. The eyes behave as though they are seeing something. But the ciliary muscle, during all of this, stays quiet. The accommodative system doesn't activate during REM. There's no near symbol target being focused on, no blur signal from the retina requesting a lens change, no conscious direction of attention to a specific distance. The lens stays flat, the zonules stay taut. The ciliary muscle, which spent the waking hours in continuous low-level activity, is as close to genuinely resting as it gets. The sphincter and dilator, meanwhile, are doing something more complicated during REM. Pupil behavior during REM sleep is variable and somewhat erratic. The pupil can dilate in bursts that correspond roughly to the eye movement episodes, then constrict again between them. The autonomic fluctuations of REM sleep affect the iris just as they affect heart rate and breathing, which also become variable and less regular during this stage. The eye during REM is moving but not seeing, active but not processing. The muscles that direct gaze are running something, a program, a rehearsal, a residue of the day's visual experience, while the muscles that adjust focus are completely offline. There's something worth noticing in that separation. The eye has different components for different aspects of vision, and sleep doesn't treat them identically. The movement system activates, the focus system rests, the pupil fluctuates, the tear film recovers, each structure following its own overnight schedule, responding to its own signals, without any of it being coordinated by anything you're doing. You're asleep. The eye is handling itself. By the time morning arrives, by the time light begins to reach the closed lids and the first signals of waking start to move through the system, the lens will be rested in a way it wasn't when the night began. The corneal surface will be better hydrated. The ciliary muscle will be carrying less residual tone. The pupil will constrict reflexively when the lids open and light arrives, and the eye will return without any instruction from you to the state it needs to be in to start another day of looking at things. It's been doing this every night, without asking, without effort, without once requiring you to understand any of it. There's a name for what the eye carries at the end of a day. Not a dramatic name, not a diagnosis, just a term that researchers use to describe something most people have felt without knowing it had a name at all. Accommodative lag, or in its more persistent evening form, sometimes called transient myopia, though that phrase makes it sound more alarming than it is. The ciliary muscle, after hours of sustained near work, doesn't fully return to its resting length when you finally look up. It tries. The signal to accommodate drops. There's no near target anymore. The brain isn't requesting a lens change. The Edinger-Westphal nucleus is reducing its drive. The muscle begins to release, but the release is incomplete. The fibres that have been held in a contracted state for hours are slow to extend back to their full resting length, the way any muscle that's been held in one position for a long time is slow to release. Not because anything is wrong with it, but because tissue has memory in the most purely mechanical sense. It was in a shape. It takes time to leave that shape. The lens, sitting in a ciliary muscle that hasn't fully released, is still being held slightly rounder than it needs to be for distance. Distance vision in this state is soft, not blurry enough to be alarming, just not as precise as it was this morning. You've felt this, probably often, the evening drive where signs take a beat longer to read. The face across the room that's recognizable but not detailed. The mild, ambient imprecision of the world past arm's length after a day of looking at things very close. That softness is a record of your day. The longer the near work session, the more pronounced the lag. The closer the working distance, a phone held at 20 centimeters versus a book at 40, the stronger the accommodative demand, and the more the muscle has to release from when the session ends. Young eyes can accumulate this lag faster than older eyes, not because they're weaker, but because they're capable of stronger accommodation in the first place, which means there's more contraction to recover from. There's a particular smell that some rooms get in the evening, not unpleasant, just the accumulated warmth of a day's worth of occupancy, the specific quality of air that's been breathed and heated and settled. Not something you'd describe to anyone, just the smell of a room being lived in. The interesting thing, and this is still forming as a thought, not a conclusion, is that the lag isn't random. It follows the shape of the day. If you spent the morning at a screen, took a long walk in the afternoon where your eyes spent time focused at distance or at nothing particular, and returned to near work in the evening, the lag at bedtime reflects primarily the evening session. The afternoon walk did something. The distance focus gave the ciliary muscle genuine release time, allowed the fibers to extend more fully, reset the baseline downward before the evening session began. Outdoor distance, in other words, isn't just good for the developing eye and its myopia risk. It's good for the adult eye's daily recovery. The muscle benefits from having something far away to look at, or nothing at all. An unfocused gaze at an open sky, where the ciliary muscle receives no signal to accommodate and simply rests at its flattest available length. Most modern days don't provide much of this. The lag at bedtime is therefore often larger than it would have been for a person whose day involved more variation in focal distance. Not dangerously larger, not permanently larger. By morning it will be gone. Sleep, with its near-complete withdrawal of accommodative drive, allows the ciliary muscle to release over hours in a way that an evening of reduced screen use alone might not fully accomplish. The reset happens overnight, but there's something worth sitting with in the idea that the eye at this moment, right now as you lie here, is still carrying some portion of today. The specific near work you did, the distance you held your phone, the number of hours you spent with your eyes fixed close, all of it is still present in the ciliary muscle as a residual mechanical state. The muscle is releasing it slowly as the night deepens and the autonomic system quiets, and the Edinger-Westphal nucleus receives less and less drive from the cortical attention systems that have finally, after a long day, stopped asking the eye to focus on things. It's releasing right now, not quickly, not all at once, in the slow tissue-paced way that mechanical states dissolve, gradually without announcement, in increments too small to feel individually but real enough that by morning the measurement would be different. The residue of today is leaving, and the eye that wakes tomorrow will start from a place that's closer to neutral than the eye that's lying here tonight, carrying the day, releasing it slowly, doing what it does every night without needing to be asked. which is, when you think about it, a reasonable way to end a day, and a reasonable place to rest. The eye doesn't know how to be completely still, even now, even in the dark, with nothing to look at, with the lids closed and the room quiet and the day finally genuinely over. The ciliary muscle is making small corrections. The pupil is drifting and settling. The lens is hovering at some intermediate focal length, not quite fully relaxed, not quite accommodating for anything, just sitting in the narrow range of states the eye occupies when the demands on it have dropped but haven't disappeared entirely. This isn't a flaw, it's just what the eye is. A system that has been responding continuously since before you were born doesn't arrive at stillness easily. The ciliary muscle has been contracting and partially releasing since the first weeks of fetal development, when the structures were still forming, when the eye was still deciding what shape to be. The iris muscles have been active since before there was light to respond to. The feedback loops that govern focus and pupil size have been running for as long as you've had eyes capable of running them. Stopping for these systems isn't a natural state. Reducing is. The oscillations that the eye makes even at rest, the tiny movements of the pupil, the small fluctuations in ciliary tone, the microsaccades of the extraocular muscles that persist even in near sleep, these are measurable. They have names in the literature. Hippus, for the spontaneous rhythmic fluctuations in pupil diameter that occur without any change in light. Physiological nystagmus, for the constant tremor of the eye that keeps images from fading. These movements are so small and so continuous that they register as baseline, as nothing, as the eye simply being the eye. But they're there. The pupil, in the particular quiet of late night, is probably sitting somewhere in the mid to large range, the sympathetic system winding down, the dilator receiving less drive, but the room dark enough that the dilator has been getting some signal all along, not at its maximum, not at its minimum, somewhere between, drifting slightly as the autonomic balance shifts in real time, as breathing changes, as the nervous system moves through the shallow oscillations of pre-sleep. You probably can't feel any of this. That's the thing about the eye that accumulates as a fact across the length of a video like this one. How much is happening that doesn't surface? The ciliary muscle has been working all day, and you felt none of it except when it was tired. The iris has been contracting and releasing thousands of times, and you noticed none of the individual adjustments. The tear film has been breaking and reforming with every blink, and the only time it became visible was when the blink stopped coming and the surface started to dry. The body is extraordinarily good at keeping its own work invisible. The eye especially so. What the eye does, the actual mechanical and electrochemical and neurological work of it, is so far below the level of experience that experience itself seems like the whole thing. You look, you see. The gap between those two events, the enormous biological machinery that bridges them, is silent. Not because nothing is happening, because everything is happening so smoothly, so continuously, so far below the threshold of sensation that it produces no noise worth reporting. And tonight that machinery is doing what it does every night. The ciliary muscle is drifting toward its least contracted state, pulled there by the withdrawal of parasympathetic drive that sleep brings. The lens is flattening, degree by slow degree, the accumulated tension of a day's accommodation dissolving into the hours of genuine optical rest that only sleep provides. The corneal surface is sitting under its closed lids, the tear film undisturbed, the epithelial cells doing their quiet overnight repair of whatever the day asked too much of. The pupil is small or moving towards small, the parasympathetic dominance of deep sleep settling over the iris, the way it settles over the heart rate and the breathing. Everything slower, everything a little more inward, everything running at the pace the body prefers when the world has stopped demanding things of it. The extraocular muscles are resting. The optic nerve is carrying less. The visual cortex is doing something. It's never fully quiet. It processes the internally generated imagery of dreaming. The residue of visual experience replaying informs the waking mind won't remember clearly. But it's doing it without requiring the eye to point anywhere, without asking the lens to accommodate, without needing the pupil to manage incoming light. The eye is, in the only sense available to it, resting. Not still, never fully still, but resting in the oscillating, continuously adjusting, never quite zero way that biological systems rest. Always doing something, but doing the smallest available version of it. The version that maintains function without demanding resources. The version that keeps the system ready for morning without spending anything it doesn't need to spend tonight. There is something in this. In the eye's inability to stop completely. In its continuous small adjustments even in sleep and darkness. That feels less like a limitation and more like a kind of reliability. The eye will be there in the morning. Not because you managed it or maintained it or did anything deliberate to keep it running, but because these systems, running below experience, below awareness, below anything you'd call effort, simply continued. They've been continuing your whole life. The lens will be a fraction flatter by morning than it is right now. The ciliary muscle will be carrying less residual tone. The corneal surface will be better for the hours of lid closure. The pupil will respond quickly and without hesitation when light arrives, and you will open your eyes and see immediately, automatically, without any awareness of the biological negotiation that made it possible, and it will feel like the simplest thing in the world, because the eye made sure it would. If you're still here, still awake, even just barely, thank you for spending this time with the Sleepy Biologist. These videos exist because of the people who keep coming back, who leave comments about where they listened from, who share episodes with someone who needed a quiet night. If this one helped, a like goes a long way. It's a small thing that makes a real difference in whether more people find their way here. And if you'd like to support the channel more directly, memberships and super thanks are open, and every contribution goes back into making these longer, quieter, more carefully made. There's a comment somewhere below this video waiting for you to tell me where you listen from tonight. A bed, a couch, somewhere unexpected. I read them. They matter more than you might think. Sleep well. The eye is handling the rest.